Hey everyone, and welcome to History Highlights, where today we're taking a deep dive into one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century, the Bosnian Genocide.
This isn't an easy topic and most definitely not a highlight, so we want to give it a heads up before we get started. We'll be discussing war crimes, ethnic violence, and genocide, so proceed with caution.
Today we will attempt to understand how it happened, why it happened, and how the world responded, or in this case, didn't. And most importantly, to honor the lives that were lost by refusing to forget. And with that, let's start with how we got here.
So let's rewind for a second. The early 1990s. The Cold War is ending, communism is collapsing across Eastern Europe, and Yugoslavia, this multi-ethnic federation, is falling apart. Various ethnic groups had lived under Yugoslavia's communist government until the decline of communism occurred. Slovenia and Croatia provinces declared independence, resulting in a war between Serbia and the two because Serbia wanted to stay a part of Yugoslavia. Now people started to see each other as enemies. When Bosnia, having three main ethnic groups, Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs, wanted to leave in 1992, Bosnia Serbs didn't want to. They wanted to stay with Serbia. Serbia said that they wanted to protect Serbian people in Bosnia, but truly wanted to get rid of any non-Serbs.
Right. The Soviet Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was founded during World War II and was made of 6 republics. One of them was Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnia was incredibly diverse, home to Bosniaks, who are mostly Muslim, Serbs, who are Orthodox Christians, and the Croats, who are Catholic. Now, let's take into account that the Croats can be mixed up with the Croatians and Serbians. For a long time, they lived side by side, but when independence came into question, lots of tension developed.
Now, Bosnia then declared independence, but that's when everything exploded. Bosnian Serb leaders, backed by the Serbian government and President Slobodan, weren't okay with this. They wanted territory that was ethnically Serb.
And the way they planned to achieve that was by getting rid of everyone else around them. That meant ethnic cleansing, forcing non-Serbs, especially Bosniaks, out of their homes, and worse. All right, now let me transition this over to our other two hosts, Smera and Khushi.
Thank you, Srita, for that intro. Now let's get into it. How does a genocide like this even start?
Right? It's not like one day everything's fine and then the next there's mass killing. Genocide usually happens in stages. Experts say there are 8 main stages, and in Bosnia we can clearly see at least 5, honestly more.
Let's start with classification. That's when society gets divided into us versus them. Serbia claimed that they were protecting the Serb population in Bosnia, but really, it was about controlling territory and removing non-Serbs. So that clear divide started forming, Serbs versus non-Serbs. And that's the start of the genocide logic.
Next is symbolization, basically forcing people to identify themselves. Like in the Holocaust, Jews had to wear yellow stars.
In Bosnia, it wasn't exactly the same, but in some areas, Bosnian Serb authorities forced non-Serb citizens to wear white armbands whenever they left their homes.
That's scary. It was like a visual target on your body.
Right? And people have called it a visual manifestation of hatred. It marked non-Serbs as outsiders and as threats, and it made them easy to identify, isolate, and attack.
Then comes discrimination, when laws and policies started stripping away people's rights.
In Bosnia, non-Serbs, mainly Bosniaks, were kicked out of government jobs. They lost political power and were denied access to public services, and basically became second-class citizens.
In areas controlled by Serbs, Bosniaks couldn't move freely, own property, or use public facilities. All those basic rights, gone.
So the system itself was turned against them. Everything was designed to push non-Serbs out.
Next is dehumanization, where the targeted group is treated as less than human.
Yeah. In the Rwandan genocide, the Tutsis were referred to as cockroaches. In Bosnia, Serbia media painted Bosniaks as traitors and terrorists.
That language made people feel like violence was okay. Bosniak women were especially targeted with widespread sexual violence, and civilians were tortured and killed without mercy.
It's hard to hear, but this stage is what allows genocide to happen. When you stop seeing someone as human, it's easier to justify harming them.
Now, here's the thing. Genocide doesn't just happen spontaneously. It's organized.
Right. In 1995, the VRS, also referred to as the Bosnian Serb Army, invaded Srebrenica, a UN-declared safe zone. And these weren't random attackers. They were trained and equipped for ethnic cleansing.
And they weren't alone. Paramilitary groups like Arkan's Tigers also played a big role. They carried out mass killings, forced removals. It was systematic. Political and military leaders coordinated it all.
Then we get to polarization, where hate speech and propaganda deepen the divisions.
The Serb-controlled media really went all in. They blamed Bosniaks for the war.
And there were so many fake stories that fueled fear. People who used to live together peacefully started seeing each other as threats.
Communities turned against themselves, and that kind of mindset, it leads directly to violence.
By the persecution stage, it wasn't just about hate. It was about taking action. This meant the targeted groups were attacked, isolated, and stripped of everything.
Bosniaks were forced into camps where they were tortured, raped, and starved. Thousands were kicked out of their homes. Their property was stolen or destroyed.
And then there's Srebrenica. July 1995. Over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were executed after being separated from their families. It was one of the worst massacres in Europe.
This is the part most people think of when they hear the word genocide: extermination.
Entire villages were completely wiped out. People were hunted down and killed. It was not chaotic, it was deliberate. They wanted to erase the Bosniak population from the land.
They called it ethnic cleansing, but it met the full legal definition of genocide. This was systematic killing and meant to destroy a group of people.
And even after all of that, with all of the evidence, we get to the last stage, denial.
Some Serb leaders still claim it wasn't genocide. They say the numbers were exaggerated or it was just war. They even moved mass graves to hide the truth.
Yeah, but courts like the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia said otherwise. People got life sentences.
Still, denial is a major roadblock to reconciliation. Without truth, there can't be healing.
So yeah, these stages didn't just happen out of nowhere. They were built up slowly with propaganda, politics, and hate until it exploded in one of the deadliest genocides in modern Europe.
And understanding how it unfolded is key, not just for history, but so we can recognize the signs of when they start showing up again.
Alright, so something we really need to talk about is how propaganda made the Bosnian genocide possible. I mean, how do you even convince people to turn on their neighbors? It doesn't start with guns, it starts with lies.
Exactly. One of the most powerful propaganda techniques used was scapegoating, blaming one group for everything that's wrong. In this case, it was the Bosniaks, especially Muslims. Serbian media made them out to be monsters.
A perfect example of this was the use of the tabloid Večernje Novosti. They published this totally fake story that showed an illustration of a Serbian child whose whole family had supposedly been murdered by Bosnian Muslims.
Yeah, and that image, though completely made up, was super emotional and graphic. It was meant to shock people and make them hate and fear Muslims. And this wasn't some underground rumor. It was out there in the mainstream media, which made it feel credible.
And it didn't stop there. There were these false claims being spread that Muslim doctors were sterilizing Serbs, and even that all Muslims had been giving a list of Serbs to kill. Like, think about how terrifying that would sound to the average person reading that.
It's clear who this was aimed at: the general Serbian population, especially those with limited access to other information. People reading these stories were being fed fear 24/7.
And the intended impact to create panic, to make Serbs believe that they were under attack. That way, violence didn't just feel acceptable, it felt like self-defense.
The language in these reports were meant to stir up fear and rage. Words like murdered, targeted, genocide. Even though the Bosniaks hadn't done these things, those words planted the idea that they would.
And yeah, it was pretty effective. People actually believed those lies. It fueled ethnic hatred and made people see their neighbors as dangerous enemies, and paved the way for the violence that followed.
It's horrifying to think how one fake story and a few manipulated headlines could help trigger genocide. But that's the power of propaganda.
A propaganda technique that shaped public opinion during the Bosnian genocide was card stacking. It's when the media highlights certain information, usually the stuff that supports a particular agenda, while other facts are omitted.
Right? It's essentially like telling a half-truth, but making it sound like the whole story. In Bosnia's case, Serbian media promoted only the information that painted their government and military as powerful and righteous, while completely suppressing anything that would alter this image.
The report of the International Commission on the Balkans described this perfectly. It said, the public is not able to inform itself about the actions of the government. Lacking elementary information about the motives and intentions of its leaders, it has been kept blindfolded and disoriented.
That's so scary. When you don't even know what your own government is doing and you're being intentionally kept in the dark, it becomes really easy to get manipulated.
Exactly. This technique was aimed at average citizens, people who were just trying to make sense of a confusing, violent time. By only showing what supported their version of the truth, leaders made sure people couldn't question them.
And it led to misinformed citizens who had no idea what was really going on. It made it easier for the government to carry out its plans without any resistance.
So one big propaganda technique the Bosnian Serb leadership used was name-calling, basically labeling entire groups as the enemy to justify their actions.
Right. In speeches, they constantly reminded the Bosnian Serb population about crimes supposedly committed against Serbs by Muslims and Croats. They made Muslims and Croats out to be the historic enemies.
Yeah, and this wasn't just about the past. They stressed that recognizing these groups as enemies was crucial for the survival of the Serb people. It was like if you don't see them as enemies, Serbs won't survive.
Exactly, and the accused, the Bosnian Serb leader, also pushed the idea that their party, the SDS, was the only one protecting Serbs from these threats.
This all came through powerful speeches, political rhetoric delivered directly to the Bosnian Serb population.
Which makes sense because the intended audience was the Bosnian Serbs, especially those who might be worried or scared about their future after the conflict.
And the goal? To stir up fear and suspicion against Muslims and Croats, making Serbs feel they had to unite behind the SDS to survive. It created a strong us versus them mentality.
But the language they used was key. Calling Muslims and Croats the historic enemies wasn't just informative, but it was emotionally charged. It allowed them to point a finger directly at these groups and make them out to be threats.
So it made it easier for the leadership to push for ethnic separation and to convince people to support their political goals.
And did it work? Well, definitely. This kind of name-calling has deepened ethnic divisions and justified the political moves that led to violence.
So, what did the world do while all of this was happening?
Honestly, not much at first. The UN passed resolutions. NATO did have a campaign, but it did not prove decisive in ending the conflict, and it wasn't successful in attracting the international community. And the West was reluctant to get involved in another Balkan war.
It wasn't until the Srebrenica massacre and international outcry that real intervention happened. The Dayton Records were signed in November 1995, ending the war.
But for thousands of families, it was too late.
After the war, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was set up. Key leaders like Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic were eventually convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity. But justice takes time, and in Bosnia, healing is still happening. Mass graves are still being discovered and families are still identifying their loved ones. And ethnic tensions, they haven't disappeared.
But there's also resilience. Memorials have been built. Survivors speak out. The memory of Srebrenica is kept alive, not out of hate, but out of hope. Hope that remembering is the first step to preventing.
Before we close, here are two big questions we want to leave you with. 1. What role does propaganda play in shaping public support for violence, and how can we recognize it before it's too late? And 2, how should the international community respond when early signs of genocide appear, and what responsibility do we have to act?
Now, if you've made it this far, thank you. This isn't just history. This is a story about people, families, futures, and the power of silence, and the power of speaking up. We hope that this episode helped you understand not just what happened, but why it matters. For more resources, check the show notes and our works cited list.
You've been listening to History Highlights. Let's never forget.